Today in the EU, NATO's 75th anniversary with spotlight on enlargement and countering Russia. As NATO marks its 75th anniversary in Brussels, the military alliance reflects on its times of peace and stability in view of two crucial challenges ahead: navigating the selection of a new Secretary General and its relations with Russia and the strategy to achieve peace. Hello and welcome. I am Evicchiori and this is Today in the EU. To talk about what we should keep an eye on regarding NATO's meeting, we spoke with Aurelie Pugnet, Euractiv's politics editor. Aurelie, this is not the first time that we are talking about NATO. As we know, foreign ministers are gathering today for NATO's anniversary. We have a lot on the agenda, but what is the most immediate message that NATO wants to send across?
What we really hear from the NATO diplomats is how NATO has, they say, managed to keep the continent, or at least the area of the NATO territory, relatively at peace.
There is peace and security for those who are under the umbrella of the alliance. We cannot guarantee peace and security outside, but we assist countries like Ukraine to fight against those who wish to dominate them. We will continue doing so, and we will keep the door open for others to join the alliance when the time has come,
said Ambassador Dr. Geza Andreas von Gier, who is also the German permanent representative to NATO.
Now, that does strike a bit of a surprise to someone who reports on Ukraine. And of course, we read a lot of coverage and we see what's happening in Ukraine. And there is obviously a war just very close to NATO borders. It's just across the border, really.
So we need to shift the dynamics of our support. We must ensure reliable and predictable security assistance to Ukraine for the long haul, so that we rely less on voluntary contributions and more on NATO commitments, less on short-term offers and more on multi-year pledges. Therefore, ministers will discuss how NATO could assume more responsibility for coordinating military equipment and training for Ukraine, anchoring this within a robust NATO framework.
Said NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg while arriving in Brussels, emphasizing the shift towards a NATO-based contribution rather than relying solely on domestic voluntary efforts.
So the ministers will also have to show Ukraine, to give the messages that they're not forgetting about them and that they will continue support and that will, for the long term, that's the idea.
Now, a key topic on the table is the future of diplomatic relations with Russia, not just in the context of the war in Ukraine, as we just mentioned, but also in anticipation of what lies ahead in peacetime. So what are the predictions on this?
NATO has been regarding Russia now as the number one enemy, really, since the war in Ukraine started 2 years ago. And the situation is, at the moment, the war has made the relationship pretty much inexistent, but Russia will always be there. So the question is, how do you have some sort of strategy towards a country that used to be a partner? And how do you imagine support to maybe civil society, like some countries talk about, or how do you make sure that you don't lose that link where you see still what's happening on the ground, where you actually have intel coming back? So the strategy towards Russia is not just what kind of relationship you have with them during the war or in peace, it's also in that in-between.
How do you get to peace then?
Exactly, but not even how do you get to peace. It's also how do you contain or how do you anticipate what could come out of Russia. It's also about tackling propaganda, about misinformation. One important point that has been raised by diplomats is the fact that Russia has actually changed itself in the past 2 years since the war started. What this means is Russia was obviously having relationships with China, and we knew that China was becoming a growing concern for some NATO allies like the US, where they were anticipating trade disputes and more aggressiveness is what they were saying. So the fact that China would be supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine with delivery of components or technologies, or even more than this, that is something that has to be factored in the relationship that NATO wants to have with Russia. It's also about the fact that Russia is getting deliveries from North Korea, military deliveries. It's all those things that were not maybe taken into account or not as seriously a couple of years ago. And obviously, for some countries, it's very important to think about that.
And we saw Finland and Sweden having joined the alliance quite swiftly, while Ukraine is still missing a formal invitation. So will that be the elephant in the room at this meeting?
Maybe not this meeting, but definitely over the next few months. There is a NATO summit happening in July in Washington. And I mean, everyone expects the Ukrainians to put a lot of pressure on this. It's obviously their dream. They think it would obviously make them safe, and they're right. However, it's not happening. Diplomats are very clear that it's not happening. It's just too soon. Ukraine has reforms to do. It's still at war. And so a lot needs to be handled before that happens. They say it's not a question of if, but when.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. It is a question of when, not if.
Mentioned Jens Stoltenberg in relation to Ukraine becoming a member of the NATO alliance. And you wrote this week about the US effort to coordinate Ukraine's support under NATO, especially in view of Donald Trump's second term. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
At the moment, the US are coordinating what we call the Ramstein meeting, which is the Ukraine support group. And this is where about 50 countries around the world, allies of Ukraine, gather together every month around that time and see how to best support Ukraine, which is, seeing, okay, well, you have this in your stock. This is what Ukraine needs. Okay, can you jump on this at the moment? It's very specific. It requires a lot of military planning. And basically, the issue is we don't know what's going to happen in the US in November. And in Europe as well, which is there might be a major political shift. There might be someone coming in the White House that is against support to Ukraine. So there has to be a way to institutionalize this and make it more permanent. So one idea is to transfer those tasks from the Ramstein group to NATO. It's still under discussion and it would take a long time. And there are still a lot of questions being unanswered. One of those is, would the coordination of lethal aid, so weapons that can actually kill, compared to medical assistance, if you will, be handled by NATO? Because until now, NATO has been extremely clear about the fact that it is not getting involved into weapons deliveries.
That's a national matter.
Exactly. It's a national matter. It's about bilateral donations handle that. So there is a fine line to walk where NATO will not become part of the conflict.
Why?
Because it will not be a belligerent, because it will not get itself dragged into a war with Russia. However, there is a need, some say, to protect the support to Ukraine. So how can you fix this issue without crossing that line is basically the question. And that comes also with money. Where do you find the money? And there's been a figure around 100 billion euros being floating around, both in EU circles and NATO circles. So apparently this is what Ukraine needs to win. But where does that money come from? And where exactly is it going? And how is it being channeled?
Will it be available? And
Exactly. It's a lot of open questions. What we know is that everyone is hoping to find a solution for the summit because, you have to give something to Ukraine.
So we're talking by July then?
We're talking about July, definitely.
And today's meeting takes place shortly after the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Paris. The encounter happened right after an explosion killed a senior Iranian commander in Syria, raising concerns about escalating tensions in the already tense Middle East. So what does NATO's response look like for now?
NATO is not getting itself involved. They don't want a greater war. They don't want an escalation. They don't want Iran to get involved. This is as far as it's gone. It's more of a bilateral situation between the US and Israel. It's not discussed necessarily as such. Informal discussions between the ministers this week. However, it will be in the backdrop because it is another war you have to keep an eye on.
And Macron has proposed to send troops on the ground to Ukraine during the summit in Paris.
Il n'y a pas de consensus aujourd'hui pour envoyer de manière officielle, assumée.
There is no consensus at this stage to send troops on the ground. Nothing should be excluded. We will do everything that we must so that Russia doesn't win, Macron mentioned. Now, this was something that polarized opinions. Can you give us a bit of context on what were the reactions and why are we talking about this?
So Macron said that the West should not exclude sending troops to Ukraine. What that means in the French strategic ambiguity, as they call it, is that you keep the door open to potential next steps in the war, and the next steps of support from the West to Russia, without saying whether you will actually take them or not. And so it's a bit like having the nuclear weapon. Everyone knows you have it. Once in a while, you mention it. Just as a friendly reminder, he floated around the idea, saw how people reacted. At least people know that the French are not excluding it. Whether the French will actually send troops to fight or to train or to equip or something in Ukraine, it still remains to be seen. But the thing is, it won't be under NATO banner, and this is very important, at least not for now. Some say that there could be a training mission at some point for Ukrainian soldiers, but we're not talking within the year. We're talking later, at a later stage, in the future, if it is relevant. And also the thing is, you have to remember, it would not be considered a trigger of the mutual defense clause if a French or any other national from a Western ally. What you have to keep in mind is that NATO does not want to be dragged into a conflict, and its members either. So even if the French were to send some troops to Ukraine and one of them would get killed, it would not be considered as a trigger to the mutual defense clause, which means that it would not be considered an attack against the whole alliance.
Because that's a national decision. It's not like an alliance decision.
And also, it's not targeting, they say, directly the alliance. Now, again, that's a point for strategic ambiguity that they say.
So blurry lines as well.
Exactly, blurry lines. And this is how you always, you don't show your cards. It's a war. It's in the game of bluff also.
And the previous time that we talked about NATO, we did already start on a guessing game for the NATO Secretary General. I remember that Mark Rutte was the favorite one. Do we have any updates on this?
So since we last spoke, which was barely a month ago, a new name did appear, which is the name of the Prime Minister of Romania, Klaus Iohannis. He's basically another candidate challenging Rutte for the job.
Whoa.
Yes. The question is, will he withdraw his candidacy? Maybe. Will Rutte do it? Will someone else pop up in the meantime? What we see for now is that there are very few countries that are either opposing or not speaking in favor of Rutte. The two main hurdles that Rutte has to overcome, or the two countries that he has to convince, are Hungary and Turkey. Hungary, because they don't appreciate giving a job to someone who's criticized their rule of law record. And Turkey is concerned over the fact that maybe the Netherlands would not take counterterrorism seriously enough. So they have concerns. They want them addressed. Whether that will be fixed and before the summit, we'll see.
Because we're again aiming for July for this to be resolved, or before the European elections.
Ideally, a lot of them would have wanted the name to be fixed before the European elections to avoid the horse trading and the name being thrown into the whole process of something that doesn't have anything to do with it. It's the military alliance. It should be another process. However, Stoltenberg, the current Secretary General, he's on the job until October 1st. So technically,
they could also push it.
Exactly. I mean, they could wait until that time, and then they could even extend him again. That sounds unlikely.
Why unlikely?
The US have said publicly that they will not extend Stoltenberg, that they completely support Rutte. France, Germany, the UK have also publicly supported Rutte, which gives him a lot of weight in the race. But you still have to convince the other ones.
Thank you, Aurelie, for prepping us on what to expect from the NATO anniversary meeting. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saez de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.